Okay, it should be recording now. So, um, welcome to this Discord chat. FileWave deployment's getting started. Like I was saying, it's going to be hopefully maybe a conversation, and I'll definitely walk through things and do demo stuff too. Um, but yeah, questions are good. And if you want to be able to speak, you just hit the little raise hand icon at the bottom, or use the text chat. And I'll be watching the text chat on my other screen so that I don't miss out on something. But um, let's see. And if for some reason my shared screen is not large for you, the way Discord works is you can click on the little screen share window and you can kind of change it to be different sizes. It could be from a thumbnail to full screen. So you should be able to adjust it to make it really viewable. Okay. So good. And a couple of people joined. So let's let's get started and interrupt at any point with a chat or with a voice question. So okay, here we go. So I guess I want to start out with, you know, material that you would look at. And I did put in the text chat yesterday in preparation for this. If you look, you'll see there's a link to it. Now it goes to the BBB knowledge base. On Friday, we're changing DNS, so that'll change to kb.filewave. But in our knowledge base, the link that's in the text chat has this whole association to deployment strategy guide that Tony Keller made. And I think it is definitely a good read. I don't want to obviously just walk through and read the stuff in this because that wouldn't be a very good use of the time. But this has pretty much everything, I guess, that we would talk about in this. And it has this other article when we added deployments to be able to edit them in FileWave Central. I put this article in this guide too, as well. And just one more note on the new knowledge base. You can use it now. I sent out an email yesterday on it. So you can either go to the BBB or that go.filewave link that was in the email. When you come here, one of the things we've done, and we're going to have a session next week on the new knowledge base, but just quickly, if you go here to look for information, don't feel like you have to dig and find things, although we did categorize everything, I think, much better. There is this little chat bot here, and it has an index of everything. And when you ask it questions, think about it like you're asking a person. So if you say like boosters, and that's all you write as a question, well, that's not going to give you a very good answer. But if you give it some background on why you want to, what you want to know, and how can I set up boosters for multiple sites or something, like be a bit specific, and then you will get really good answers with the link to the article. So that's the last thing. And next week I'm going to record a session on the new knowledge base. Uh, It'll all be much easier once it has its rightful URL. So okay. So now deployments. You can see them here in Anywhere. They've been in Anywhere, for a while. The problem was that they weren't in Central. So Central is the native, what we used to call the native admin. Um, but then deployments got added, and you could kind of view them, right? Um, and so what exists today is associations and deployments as two separate ideas that you can see in both places, right? So I can see all my associations. I can see whatever deployments I have. They can both exist. You can use whichever one you want. You can edit them in both places. Um, so now you might think about, well, what's the future of this? The future is we want to get you from associations to deployments now that they exist in both places. But we know that probably there are things about deployments that we didn't think of, that will be, like a deal breaker on using them. And so what we want is that you'd at least play with deployments and open up support tickets if you find something that, like I used to do this in associations, but I can't do it in deployments, or it works differently in deployments. Let us know, because it may not have been on purpose. But the purpose of deployments was that we were rethinking how we did associations. So mainly with associations, right? And let's just do a quick thing on associations. So what you've traditionally had is file sets, which are stuff, right? So I have my superpref. I have um, groups that I can group stuff in, right? So I have in my FileWave section, I have installator, and these, I assign these all together so I can assign this group of stuff to a device or a group of devices. And that logic has always worked out. Um, and yeah, the note that Troy put in the chat, the included excluded, is the is probably the big change. When you think about, associations group stuff or a group of stuff to devices or clients or a group of them, that was kind of the end of it. Then um, you could do some fancy things with smart groups and custom fields and um, for inclusion and exclusion to some extent. You could have a custom field that said like don't include in Photoshop and then make that the criteria for the Photoshop association. But um, deployments, the big thing I'd say is that they make it so that the deployment is about all the rules about how the stuff is getting there, including whether you're including devices and groups or excluding them. And it really does let you make a single deployment that has multiple file sets. Um, Now, one other thing that is confusing for today, but I think will become less confusing, is file sets are called file sets here. They're called payloads here. They are literally the same thing. Um, I believe that I have heard that we are working towards choosing one term, and I heard that file sets were the term, but don't know 100% yet. But you could imagine that it makes a lot of sense for these to be called file sets because everyone knows file sets forever. Um, so I think you'll see that name change back so that it would be consistent. But just know that there is literally nothing different between a payload and a file set. It is just the same thing with a different name for the moment. Right? So let's go back to Central. Um, so, I can do my associations, assign stuff, and I'm sure you guys are doing that today. I mean, that's the only way you're getting things to devices. So you must be. But in the new knowledge base, we have improved the documentation around associations, and you can see we cleaned up, showed you the deployments articles. So it should be good to read over there. But let's go over like a deployment and I guess all the ways that it differs. Maybe I'll make a new deployment and I'll kind of do it in anywhere only because the UI is just slightly nicer, but they have all the same steps. So if I go to deployments and I go to make a new deployment, I have to give it a name. You'll forget to name it, and then you'll see one called new deployment, and you can always go up to the top and rename it. And I'm going to say, Discord example. Okay. And actually, maybe I'll make this more of a real thing. Call this, Windows, right? So maybe all my Windows devices, maybe I'll call it Windows Baseline. So when I was saying like the one of the big improvements is like you can group lots of content uh, under different deployments. With associations, you could group them to smart groups of devices, but I think conceptually this is a little bit better. And let's see. So I'm going to call this Windows Baseline. All my Windows machines, they should get certain software, and I want to build out what that is. So I can include groups, and what makes sense is to use my Windows Smart Group that I have. So I'm going to select that group, so that's included. Um, but maybe I have, in some example, I might have some specific machine that doesn't fall into that smart group. Now, of course, everything of my Windows does, but I'll just pick a Windows machine anyway that I know is in that group, but I'm just picking it to show an example where if there was a device that wasn't in that group but I wanted to include them, I can, and I can add multiples. And exclusions are sort of the same way. And where this makes more sense is everybody gets this Windows payload, right? except I'm going to exclude a device here. I'm going to exclude this device. For whatever reason, it doesn't get the baseline, right? So we made it really easy to just remove one device or groups of devices. And then you'll do next. Now you select, what they get. So I'm going to go in here, and these are all your file sets or your payloads. Same thing. I'm going to pick like the stuff that's in my baseline. So let's say I have this, I have this. I'm not really going to apply this to my devices, but let's say these were the file sets that I want to apply. So that one would be an unfortunate one if I actually pushed because it would remove FileWave. But you can send these, and we do support revisions as well. And actually, I don't know if I have a file set with a revision, but you can actually click on if there were multiple revisions, so you can see it there. You could pick, whatever revision so that you can apply it. And if you haven't looked at file set revisions, it's really neat. It's a way to have a single file set, like let's say you have Chrome, you have a file set for Chrome, and that file set targets a specific version. And now a new version comes out. So now you can add a new revision to that one file set. And then the way that you can move people is you can actually associate the revision, but you don't have to have separate file sets. And I actually believe I do have an example of this in my, nope, there it is. So if I go here to BB Edit, you can see that 14.6 is here and 14.6.4 is here. These are revisions, and so I could pick to associate or do a deployment based on either version. And where this is nice is that today 14.6 is out. I associate the default revision, which is 14.6. Tomorrow 14.6.4 comes out. It gets added to this file set. I associate 14.6.4 to my test group. They get 14.6.4. Everything works great. Now, what I can do is I can make this one the default. And when I do that, all the associations I did for the default revision will flip over to that new one. So, and it's neater, a little bit neater. So I don't need like a BBEdit 14.6 and then a BBEdit 14.6.4 file set. So if you haven't looked at revisions, you may want to tinker with that just for cleanliness, I guess. Okay. And so here we have the payloads that I want for this. I continue down the way from my wizard. I can choose direct or kiosk. Kiosk is where the customer or your customer can pick it, from the install software menu. Here I just have a dummy thing to make the menu show up, but they can choose to install things, so I can do that with deployments. I can do a direct installation. These selections should look familiar because associations can do them too. And if you never knew that, I just want to show quick that if I go to associations and I'll just pick this one, you can see these same checkboxes. So, we tried to bring over all the concepts that made sense so that you could, duplicate what you do in associations, but maybe make it one step better on the exclusions. So, start downloading it. Maybe you want it to be pulling down starting on Monday, that they're all trying to download it, right? But they're going to get activated on Friday, maybe in the evening. So you can kind of, pace things out. And there's also like make them inactive. Um, I know a school that actually they have a very small patching window, and they use the activate and inactive like to make it so that it'll only happen in that window, and then it kind of it's a little bit of work for them, but that's the idea that you could make the timing of it whatever you want. Okay, so then this is another enhancement over associations. Folks would say that with associations, it was very difficult to understand what was being associated and to who. When you're looking at one thing, it's easy, but when you're looking at this list, is not very structured. We don't really break out like devices. How does this device get this file set? Um, this little summary should make it really simple to just confirm to yourself how big this is, what's getting installed, to who is it getting installed. And then if I publish it, which I'm not going to do, then I'll hit cancel instead. Then it would appear in this list, just like this all Mac OS devices deployment that I have. And this one uses that dummy package, so it doesn't really matter that, for instance, I have a Windows machine in here, but I was building up an example of including my Mac OS devices, but excluding the lab and excluding this client that wouldn't have been included anyway, and that they get this payload. So you can see, like, setting up a deployment pretty easy. Um, there is also migrating over to a deployment, and these can coexist. One client can have any number of associations and any number of deployments, and they will coexist. Um, as far as us killing off associations, we do not have that yet published in the roadmap. So we're still in this place where both work, both are okay. Do some playing, do some experimenting, see which way you want to go. Um, but at a certain point, we're going to let you guys know, hey, in 6 months or in 12 months, we plan to, we want to get you off of associations, because that is the long-term goal. We don't want to have two things that are basically the same, but we do want deployments to do everything you need. So hopefully that made sense. The next thing is, how can I get a association to be a deployment, right? Because I said that you wanted to, and precedence. So between associations and deployments. So thinking about that, the client, so in both cases, so there was a good question in the chat that Troy had. A client knows what it needs to do from something called a manifest. And associations and deployments both add themselves to the manifest. And they still have like every payload has an ID number. It's kind of when it's created. So if I make payload or file set one, right, which is like my password win application, and then I make another thing and it's another application, the superpref one, it's going to have a higher number, right? So these get injected in the manifest when they're assigned, whether it's associations or deployments. And the client will install based on that manifest. So if you think about priority, there's an article actually in the new KB that talks about uh, file set priority, and it plays out the same no matter whether you're using associations or deployments, or both, because both of them will help to construct the manifest, and then the manifest will play out the same way it did. So that's what you should see. The oldest things first, the newest things later, but then there's also this thing called priority. So you may have seen it if you go to a file set, and it's a file set concept. So I clicked on the wrong thing. I meant to do this. So there's this installation priority. This is, I guess, when I said it was by the ID number, well, it is by the ID number, but it also factors in the priority. So I guess think of it like, if I have ID number 1, 2, and 3 in the manifest, you would think that 1 being the oldest goes first, then 2, then 3. But if number 3 is set to highest, it really should process before 1 and 2, if it's the only one set to highest. And that's the idea of the installation priority, to knock something to the front. If you make everything highest in your file sets, then really nothing is highest. Because then, 1, 2, and 3, if they're all set to highest, they still run in the order of 1, 2, 3. So that's something to think about. Okay, and hopefully that answered. So, now I made my first deployment. That was pretty easy. I'm gonna take an association I have and turn it into a deployment. And this is actually a real example I have. So I had made an association to test out Installator. There's a KB article on it. If you manage Macs, it's a really cool thing to, if you always want to keep certain software at the latest version, Installator is great. And I made a step-by-step article on how to do it. Um, but I have this Installator group association to, it's really set to one device now. In practice, this would probably be more than one device, but I'm just testing this and I test it with my Apple Studio. Um, I want to show you how I could understand that this was applied to the device. Some of the things in FileWave Anywhere that are a little better than Central in this way. So this is my device. These are actually all the things that are associated to the device. And I kind of hope that this UI makes it into Central because here I can see this BB Edit Installator, and you can see these little gray dots. When I click on it, it actually shows me that Installator group is associated to the Apple Studio. So where it can be kind of difficult in FileWave Central to figure out how things are associated, over here in Anywhere, and again, we should be porting things like this back into Central. You'll see them leapfrog each other, but we're going to maintain both Central and Anywhere. Um, this is a really great UI, I think, for showing you like why something is associated. So this, the FileWave client is associated to this, the highlighted smart group, right? This, the group is associated to the device. So you can tell from the highlighting. Super easy. Um, so I know that, this is part of this Installator group association. And if I look at it over here, I have this Installator group. I could do it the traditional way where I show associations of this file set and I could see it here. Um, that's a little bit easy. But in this big list, the lack of structure here is problematic. Um, so I come over here. I have my association. You have to use Anywhere to convert associations to deployments. We don't have the migration tool in Central. I don't know that we ever would add it because this is kind of like a temporary thing, a temporary reason to come here, but maybe. So I've got this association. I want to turn it into a deployment. So move to deployment. It's going to tell me that it's going to, turn it into, it's basically, now this read only actually is a good point. I brought this up to development yesterday. So in 15, you can edit them. We did not change the wording here. Ignore it about the read only. Because in 15.1 that's being pushed out just in 2 months, it will get rid of that read only. That was called to my attention by a couple of people, and I remembered yesterday that I saw it. So move to deployment. I can either move all the things in that association to an existing deployment, which might make sense if everybody gets Installator. Maybe it folds that stuff in here. But I'm going to make a new deployment, and I'm going to give it a name called Installator. Now, I'm still going to use the concept of naming it by the content. If I was putting this into like a elementary school baseline, I might call it that, and then I might fold other associations into it. But you can use deployments, much like you used associations. So I have the name. There's my Apple Studio, just like what was in there. I could change it if I realized, wait, more things should get this. So I can select groups here. I could exclude if I want. I'm going to leave this the way it is because I don't want to mess up my lab. Then it's got all the file sets as they were in the association, including for Installator itself. I was using revisions. There's only 10.4 in there right now, but you could see like this would be an example where if I had other versions, I could pick to target, and it's set on the default. So remember, if 10.5 comes out and I add that to the file set, with it set the way it is, when I make the default 10.5, they would move to it. So we can have a session all on revisions probably, but they are helpful once you kind of get used to how they work. So all this stuff. So Installator is the application. It uses Swift Dialog, so I want to make sure Swift Dialog's on the machine. I had made a BB Edit and a Visual Studio Code Installator package that I use both of these tools on my machine. I want to keep them current, so I have these. I really use this to keep my machine up to date. Um, so I'm going to keep this the same. I could select more payloads if I realized, oh wait, I have another payload for Installator that I wish I could add to here. So you can do that. I'm going to go next. These options are the way they were in the association. So if I keep it the same, it's going to behave the same. You can see everything from the license distribution. You know, with VPP, books are still licensed to users, not devices, and that's kind of why we have this to deal with, because VPP apps primarily are kind of automatically dealt with the licensing. Um, I could make this kiosk so that I have to pick to install these things. It'll make all four things show up, four or five, whatever number it was, show up as kiosk items. But I want direct installation. I want this to, anything I add to this payload or this deployment, I get ahead of myself, I want to install. So, okay, so I'm going to go next. Then it gives me this summary. Now, I'm going to preview the changes, and it's going to tell me if anything changed. Did I add other devices? Did I change it to be a kiosk app? It would show it on the confirmation screen, but it shows no changes because I didn't change anything. And I'll show you one where I do make a change. So now you can see Installator is a deployment. Okay, if I go back to associations, the Installator item should be gone. I mean, it is gone, but it should be gone because it was converted to a deployment. So when you are experimenting, it's a one-way move. This becomes a deployment. I could, if I wanted to go back to the way it was, I could destroy this and then create an association, assign it to the same people. But there's no like turn a deployment back into an association because our goal is to get you to deployments. So you can go one way, and that's why I would say do some experimenting with just example lab stuff so that you feel comfortable, and then move over to it. So let's pick something that is a mix of stuff so that you can see the confirmation screen. So let's say I wanted to send um, these, I'm going to combine. Let's just say conceptually they're both for Windows, but you can understand I don't really want to send this because it'll wipe my device if I assign it to a Windows device. But one's a kiosk and one is a standard association. So let's move it to a deployment. Move to deployment. I'm going to again pick, and in this case again, I'm just going to call this test. I'm not really going to be doing this. So you can see what it did. It added both groups because it should include both things, right? But I can, if I want, add exclusions. Um, I can add other people to get this. I can go next, and it's got both payloads. Nothing's really different there. If I wanted to, I could pick, I could change this to be a different revision if I wanted. When I go to this page, you can see there's a warning, and it says that, hey, one of these is a direct association, and one of them's a kiosk. You have to pick what to do. So I'm going to say, I want to go kiosk, right? Just as a safety mechanism in case I accidentally click and publish this. So when I go next, it will show this, it will show the stuff, it will show the payloads, it'll show the size, and when I go to review changes, this is where you can see, all the interesting things. So this was kiosk, or no, sorry, this was direct, and now is kiosk. And you can see modified. Added, these were added to the thing, and no changes. So you get a little confirmation screen. I kind of think this added, I think, I know why it shows it. You have to think about it for a second. I took two associations and smushed them together. So technically, they're both added to this new deployment, and that's why it says added. But when you first look at this, I myself get confused each time. I wonder, why does it say added? but they were being added to this new thing that you're making. Really, this item and this item are telling you what you need to know because you know you added both things and you were combining it into a new deployment. But you can see modified and no changes. So if I publish this, which I'm not going to do, I'm going to close preview and I'm going to cancel because I don't really want to make that. But you can smush together stuff, and that's where you really could look at your associations and say to yourself, "Hey, I want to mash together all sorts of things into a baseline." Um, and so far I've talked a lot about like all the positives, right? The positive is that deployments are the new thing. Deployments can combine associations. Deployments document more clearly what's happening. When you look at them, you can tell this is the stuff that's happening. Deployments leverage the same manifest system that associations do. So when I switch a deployment or create a deployment from an association, um, I don't see the device remove software and reinstall it because they still have the same software assigned. Um, there is one negative that actually I see Sean's in here, but oh wait, you picked a. I I didn't see your little the hand raised icon. Sorry about that, Sean. But this would actually be a perfect time to speak to sort of that negative that that I know you've
Hello.
raised. Hey,
Well, before I get onto the negative, there's actually a couple of negatives, but before I
hi.
get onto that, can you just jump back a stage and do a new association to deployment to get the so-called error message up?
Oh, a migration. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Y-
So the message or the part of the message that everyone features it on is actually correct. So
No.
what happens here? It, so the the association will become read only, not the deployment.
Well, so the association
So
disappears, but you can edit it in Central with
uh,
15.
you can't edit the association. You can edit the deployment. If you convert it to a deployment, then you can edit the deployment.
Oh,
The
yeah,
association is
yeah,
visible,
yeah, yeah,
but
you're
the
right.
deployment has taken over the management. So the deployment now is the thing in control. So if you try and edit the association, which was there before, which at the moment we're leaving behind from a login debug type idea, if you like. So you know that you've moved it, right? But when you do that motion of changing it to a deployment, yes, you can edit the deployment in FileWave admin,
Yes.
but you can't edit the original association. You can just see the original association. Okay, so it's the deployment that's now managing it. So from that point of view, the text is entirely, well, it's strictly speaking, correct, right?
It's just
Okay,
confusing, even to me, because I
it
didn't
is
think about
confusing,
that.
and it's particularly confusing because if you go back to the message, it says deployments can only be managed from the web admin console. That bit's not true.
Yeah, so that's what makes you
That's
think the whole
yeah,
sentence, the whole paragraph is
it,
untrue.
exactly right. So that's the bit of text that's not been updated. But everyone highlights the first bit of text saying, "Oh, I can edit it." Kind of right. You just can't edit the association anymore. You can edit the
Yeah,
deployment. Right.
that
So
is a good point.
yeah, the text clearly needs to change, but that's not the bit that's wrong. Right. The bit that's wrong is that you can now edit deployments in the central. As far as the negatives are concerned, about well, there's negatives to both of these, whether it's associations or deployments. There's a new video in the Foundry that highlights these, but
And where, by
you
the way,
can't.
where did you have that? Just so that I'll show where it
It went
is.
into the onboarding because it's in amongst where we describe um, associations. It's under file sets. Sorry, it's under associations. Sorry, yeah.
So in here,
So
okay.
there's a thing on associations, there's a thing in deployment, and then there's a thing about deployments against associations, right? And also how they're impacted in kiosk, right? So, from a negative point of view, as far as deployments are concerned, um, you can't associate the same file set twice to a single deployment, right? Now, that might sound like madness initially, but for anyone who's using revisions, it's a glorious thing. because you can associate two different revisions at the same time to one thing, right? And you can't do that with a deployment. So if you wanted to, for example, have more than one revision available through the kiosk, you'd have to create a new deployment for every single revision you've got that you want to supply to your users, right? So the moment deployments, you can't do that. You'd have to have a new deployment every single time. Associations, you can just keep associating revision after revision after revision to exactly the same group, right? And you don't have to keep making new groups for this, which is essentially what you're kind of having to do with deployments, right? Um, for that same reason, if you wanted to do timed events where you are going to change your revision in the middle of the night, right? So let's say, I don't know, just Firefox, right? You're on 112, you want to go to 113, right? You want to time it so it's out of hours so the users aren't impacted. So you go in here and you can do obviously activate files, delete files at. If you associate the same file set with two different revisions to one file set group, computer group, right? Or several, whatever. Um, you can basically specify an activate at and a delete at for the two different revisions and then set it to be in the middle of the night. Now, the only way to do that with the deployment is you'd have to create a whole nother deployment for the other revision and then set the timings in those. And that's going to get messy real fast because if you
Yeah.
use revisions extensively, you're going to start having to pick apart deployments going, oh, hang on a minute, I want to do Firefox, now I want to do Chrome, now I want to do Brave, now I want to do whatever, right? And so all of a sudden, this whole neatness that deployments has offered you is going to get pulled apart and you're going to have to start fragmenting everything just so you can do timed revision changes, right? So if you're using time revision changes, I would stick with associations. If you're trying to associate different revisions to kiosk, I would stick with associations. If you are not, then I would move to deployments, right?
Yeah.
The biggest advantage to deployments is this idea of you could kind of think of them as groups of file set groups, right? Now you could try and recreate that with associations. You could create an association group, say that's kiosk, and then you could start trying to bung all these different file set groups that you've got inside this kiosk association group. But when you do that, now what you're doing is you're making your whole setup messy and fragmented by moving around your file sets so they're in the relevant group that you want them to be in, so they action how you want on devices. Of course, chances are you don't want to organize your file sets in that way. You want to organize your file sets so here are the different browsers that we provide, or these are the Adobe pieces of software, or these are right, VPN or whatever it is. You want to sort of have them so that all the different versions are together, and then you can basically do the association to the group of things you want to associate to. But if you try and replicate what deployments do with associations, you're going to have to start dragging and having, let's say your developers use one type of browser, right? And your users are using a different type of browser. You've got to have a group for your developers, and then you've got to have a group um, for your non-developers, right? And so
Mm.
you've got one browser in one and the other browser in the other. From a file set point of view, structure, that's messy. Where have I got all my browsers? Oh, I put Firefox in this one, but I put Brave in this group, and I put Chrome in another group. Whatever, right? You're separating out all your file sets so they're illogical in your file set structure. The advantage of deployments is you don't have to mess with your file set structure at all. You can just say this should go into this deployment, and I'll name the deployment. And so your file set structure stays nice and neat. So they both have a neatness to them. They both offer something slightly differently at the moment, right? So I'd say, yeah, use deployments if you're not using the two examples we discussed. If you are doing revisions to kiosk or timed revision changes, stick with associations.
Yeah, yeah, for the moment. And I would say if you are doing that example of that Sean gave of associating two revisions of the same thing to a device for that purpose, you probably want to also let product management know. So specifically, Tony Keller, because in again inside the Foundry, if you go into the 101 course, there is the roadmap and the feedback portal. And so, what would be super is as you're using deployments, looking at how you can use them. If you encounter something where you're like, oh, I can't use it because of this, then getting feedback, to Tony would be really important because the last thing we'd want to do is say, okay, deployments are finished and we're going to start to phase out associations, and we don't want to do that if we find out that there's something that we can't do in deployments. So even if you do exactly the example that Sean gave, you should still give feedback because when we hear it from customers, it lets us prioritize stuff, and sort of explain internally to the developers because you might also explain your use case slightly differently from how Sean would imagine it. So it is worth putting in there. Okay. So then good. So far we made a deployment. We converted an association to a deployment. We went through what it would look like to select more than one association to a deployment and how you'd see the changes. Um, we went over the problems that could occur. Um, I didn't show, I said, hey, now we can edit deployments over here, but I didn't actually show any of them. So Installamator is good because I did convert that as an example. So I'll double click on that, and in here you'll see included and excluded. The UI is a little different than the web um, for include and exclude. So let's say I add uh, a group. You can see groups and clients show in the single box, whereas in Anywhere, you'll see two separate boxes. Yeah. So I'm not sure which way we're going, if we're going to make this the UI in Anywhere or change this to be more like Anywhere, but exclusions are the same way. I can exclude a group and I can exclude a machine. So I can do the same thing, super easy. File sets, these are and you can see we call it file sets over here, even though over in Anywhere it's payloads. And so we know that is a thing with the naming. So I think file sets is what we're going to land on. But you can see the revision of all the same stuff. You can see the options here. What you don't get over here is that summary, that nice summary that's over in the web, in the same way. So that'd be a nice thing if we could add that. But you can do all the same options here. And when you hit OK, you make the changes, and then you should have to do a model update just like anything else. And then that would be live. I would say there is one sort of thing with model update in particular. And then I saw there were a couple of chats, and I'll take a look at that. But when you go into a deployment, this is a quirk that I looked at in previous versions. Um, so when you come here and I want to make a change, I have to hit edit, right? And then if I change something and hit save, my understanding is that change is effective immediately. But that change would have to be, so let me go and edit again. So if I, for instance, flip this to be a kiosk self-service, my understanding is that change happens kind of immediately. If a device then discovers it, it would think that it's a kiosk thing. I have to go back and look, and you'll probably see this. I just want to mention it when you're experimenting, if you notice the same, because it was something that I noticed in earlier versions. Uh, Now, assigning targets to it, I believe that still requires a model update. But I feel like this acts a little bit like custom fields, where when you change a custom field, it doesn't need a model update for that new custom field to be running. Um, so take a look at that and see if that's a concern and use the product feedback to say like, hey, I don't like this, or hey, I don't like model update. So maybe we could get rid of model update. I don't know if we would get rid of model update, but it is a good gatekeeper for changes. If anything, I'd say we should be more strict and show exactly what model update does gatekeep, because there are a couple of exceptions. So precedents. If I've associated a file set to a group and added a member of the same group to a deployment with an older revision of the same file set. Ooh, that is tricky. The deployment with the older revision should apply over the association, as the deployment will have a higher numbered ID. Uh, do, 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 do. The older version, and that is where you could still have two two revisions of the same thing, uh, and still be using deployments, because one of them's being done in association in that example. So in that case, the older one would go first and then the newer one would run, would be my understanding, because it's really all about that older revision has an older ID number tied to it, and so I believe it should play out in that order. And what would happen?
We don't actually do both installs, right? If you've got something that's got associated twice by two different methods, or there's overlaps, like self-healing files, whatever, um, we don't do both. It's just the one that wins, right? So the manifest calculates which is the winning one, and then the winning one actions, right? So it's not like, oh, I'll run this one, and now I'll run another one.
Well, but what would happen? So we know what happens when both are in an association. But if one's in a deployment and one's in an association, the manifest will, in theory, then just have
Right.
one of them. And it
And
would probably,
I don't think I've updated the KB on this yet. There's the one about distance.
yeah, I referenced that
Right.
earlier, but I didn't
So
show
it
it.
doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter with the deployment. It doesn't matter with the association. What matters is the distance. Whether the distance is, doesn't matter whether it's come from a deployment or the distance has come from an association, the same rulings still apply. There is no difference in the ruling. Right? So nothing has changed there. It's just
Hmm.
that deployment's obviously another way to have, let's call them assignments. So you've got an association and an assignment, and a deployment is an assignment. The closest always wins. Right? So it doesn't matter how it's got there, how the assignment has been achieved. Right? The point is, what is the closest?
Yeah.
Closest will win. Right?
Okay, that makes sense to me. And this article is pretty good. Um, Maybe you want to take a look at it, Sean, and just add some
Yeah,
words to talk about.
it's on
Yeah,
my to do list.
I know. Yeah, yeah, there's a lot, but that makes sense. And the thing about your thing about if using if you do the thing with two associations of the same different revisions of the same software, like to do upgrades. I know we don't talk about that in the.
Is that not in that document as well?
It's oh no, I meant
I think if you
it.
go to the bottom, yeah, no, if you go to the bottom of this document,
Yeah,
I think there's an article about that.
you
We
thought
then
maybe it was
look at
related, or
highest association ID. So I've associated one, then I've associated another. The second one is the winning ID.
oh
So if
no,
you've got it, if
I meant the other thing, the reason that deployments might not work for somebody, like the so we have like a deployments guide, right? Deployments association strategy guide. We have this, but it doesn't have that sort of little. I know that this doesn't have that caveat about um, those couple of reasons that you would maybe not be able to use deployments. It'd probably be good to mention them somewhere in one of
okay,
these.
okay,
That was the thing I was thinking of that wasn't covered in here.
right, okay.
So And maybe
Yeah, I thought
just
you were
a
going to get onto the idea of which revision wins, or if
oh
you've
yeah
got,
yeah yeah yeah
because obviously if you didn't do the timings and then you
yep
just put two revisions in and they were equidistant,
yep
right? Then
oh
something has to win, and that's noted at the bottom where the highest association ID wins. Now, typically, that's usually the newer piece of software, right? Because
right
you've made a new association for this new thing, right? So
yep
more often than not, it's going to be expected behavior.
okay yeah yeah okay so this makes see these sessions help me too so uh, okay anyone have any other questions I mean there's not much more I don't think to deployments kind of covered the main things.
Yeah, well, I see Sean asked the question, but about the what I just described, but exactly what I just described is in the Foundry as a video, which is
Oh,
better than trying to do it in written text, right?
right. And so if you go to that
It's in the
onboarding
onboarding at the moment,
and then you
and then
go
under associated
here
deployments,
and then check out the
right?
videos
And
here.
it's there, and it's much clearer than trying to write it in text. Because it me discussing it, I'm sure it hasn't completely sunk into people's heads, right? Um, and even I wrote it down in text, I think it would still be slightly confusing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
Videos can
there's
be
a video
helpful.
on it there. I'll make a note of it in the KB, but that's by far the easiest way to describe it and show it.
Yeah, even if you just give a little summary of what it is and give a link to the
Yeah,
location
yeah.
in Foundry. So so then good. So then if anyone has any questions, again, you can raise your hand if you want to speak, or you could use chat. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap this up shortly.
I have a question in regards to using um, deployments to set a baseline.
Hmm.
So if I'm understanding correctly, if you're creating a deployment with multiple file sets to do a baseline, such as in an enrollment workflow.
Hmm.
So let's say you have 15 file sets or 15 payloads in this baseline, as opposed to in a previous associated workflow where you had 15 separate associations. Is there any difference in terms of what order things are going to be? Is one going
Oh,
to act
how will they run it?
differently than the
No,
other?
no, going back
Yeah.
to what Sean was saying, it all kind of follows this guidance because ultimately associations and deployments are two ways to construct the manifest, and it makes the manifest in the same way. So the same rules would play out,
Apply.
right, Sean?
The same rules would apply.
I'm unmuted. Yeah, no, the same rules apply. So you don't have to think of this as all deployments will act differently from associations when it comes to what runs first or whatever. All the same rulings apply. Right, the rules don't change at all. At the end of the day, all we're doing is building out a manifest, and that manifest is then actioned on the device. If there are any changes, then I have to act upon that as a device, right? Um, so all the rules still apply. So from a pure file set ID point of view, everything's associated in an even way. First one goes lowest ID first, and then so on and so forth, works its way down the list, right? Um, and everything's done. So even if you look at the priorities that in the properties, for example, that doesn't prioritize download and install all in one go. What happens is all the downloads are done in that order specified, and then all the activations are done in that order specified. So we still do all the downloads first, and then the activations, right? Um, but the rules don't change, right? Everything's still this is this is the order that we have to pick how we do things. There is a sequential order, right? And all those rules, nothing changes, right?
Yeah. Does that help you, other Sean?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, and one
I'm
other little.
beginning to
Oh, sorry.
I'm beginning to visualize all of this a lot better now. Thanks
Oh,
for
good, good.
y'all's answers.
Good, good, good. One other little plus of this new knowledge base is you can actually log in the same as you log into Foundry, same password and everything. Um, and it has a comment system. So if you're signed in, you can actually, there's a threaded comment system. And this knowledge base the next version, probably there'll be a notification system. So right now you can add comments, but we have to kind of look for them to see them, but in probably 2 months or so, there should be a notification system. So like you could subscribe to get updates when there's replies. And so where it could get interesting is, you could be reading this article, add a comment like asking a question like you asked, and then Sean might know that there was a question asked and he might reply to it, and then he might fold that question and answer into the article. So I think we could collaborate better on articles. And because it requires sign in to use the comment system, there won't be spam because uh, only FileWave customers can really have a login. So it should protect the system. So okay. So then I guess we went right up against the hour. I guess thank you guys, and I will post this on YouTube probably later today. I'll see if Nina can do it, and you'll be able to review the video. I'll stop recording it now.